let's start off with, what is financial abuse?
Financial abuse is crossing the line between smart budgeting and control. So many people believe that in order to eventually retire, you've got to have a pretty strict budget and stick to it. Fine, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But what tends to happen if one of the parties is very controlling is that they try to clamp down on spending. Well, spending is an adult activity. And what you'll see is that there's this progression over time, ratcheting up the level of control, including but not limited to, saying, limiting access to marital funds, limiting access to credit cards, and ways to use those funds. Right? So there'll be a strict budget, and what you'll eventually see, especially now that technology is so much important part of our lives, the abusive spouse will have fraud alerts and get notifications upon anything being spent by the other spouse. Now, what that means is, while controlling spending is in general a good idea, what it turns into is the abused spouse not being able to spend any money on themselves, or not having access to financial resources to, say, consult with a lawyer or do anything that's not pre-approved by that by the other spouse. Well, at some point we cross over that line and it becomes a situation that's almost as bad as physical abuse, because it's going to change a person's personality over time. The design is to erode the self-esteem, self-confidence, and ability of that person to make smart decisions in their own best interest.
So then it becomes isolating because you don't have the resources to really do anything.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So,
including therapy.
Right. When I was married, we had a spreadsheet that turned into a profit and loss statement, it turned into pie charts, and each one spreadsheet fed into the next, into the next. And, I was supposed to itemize hairspray, baby wipes. And then like the groceries were dry goods versus grocery or pantry, and then refrigerated, frozen foods. And then there were categories. And from that, it had categories. And then at the profit and loss statement, it turned into the grocery store versus eating out, and then children versus adults. And it was asinine, but if I didn't do it, there was trouble and I had to explain for it.
Yeah, in general, and I guess one way, as a CPA, I see that spreadsheets as a wonderful thing. Okay, for us financial people. We love spreadsheets. Okay. The question is there a budget item for other? Okay. So I don't have a problem with budgeting. I don't have a problem with spreadsheets, but it is the first step towards the crossing that line into negative control, because you need to budget for what you don't know, okay, for life. If you're saving for a trip to Disney World, that needs to be in the spreadsheet. Okay. And and I guess one of the telltale signs would be if the supported spouse feels uncomfortable asking for something for themselves. And I'm not talking about a $1,500 pair of shoes. I'm talking about just basic $200 a month to go see a therapist. And if you don't feel comfortable asking for that, that's a big red flag for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess those need to be two-way conversations, and how we're going to budget and, what those categories are. Can it be, items for, children's health care, or can it be, items we use to get ready in the morning, or does it have to be, minute little categories that it would take a long time to prepare a budget?
Yeah.
So how is this used in a divorce process against each other?
Okay.
We talk about relationships versus divorce.
Right. So by the time, let's say I have a spouse in my office that's been the victim of financial abuse, they won't know most of the time they've been the victim, just like emotional abuse. Right. So I'll figure that out probably an hour into the initial consultation, maybe 20 minutes. Who knows? But what's very interesting about it, there's a couple of different problems. One, identifying the behavior is step one. Step two is figuring out what do we do with it. Okay. Now, my experience has been often positive, because if the divorce has fallen through, there's money in the estate because the spouse was very frugal. Okay. And one of my most memorable cases, I represented the wife of a neurologist, and the neurologist was fanatical about saving money, which is good because my client had been married a long time. They didn't live in a big expensive house. He didn't drive a big expensive car, and there was a significant amount of money to divide, which allowed my client to not really have to work that much after the divorce, which is nice. But the other side is, what was the damage to the emotional core processor, if you will, of the abused spouse? Okay. So this particular spouse didn't have restrictions. She could still do art. She could still do a lot of things, but it wasn't, it was certainly frowned upon and made her upset about it. Now, once we identify that we have the financial abuse situation, one of the positives is I've got the financial records to the penny. We need to get a copy of those spreadsheets, a copy of the program, because a lot of couples have personal financial software that they use because it's super easy to pay bills now and all that other kind of stuff. But so in some ways it makes my job easier. Where it makes it tremendously difficult is for my client to begin the recovery process. And the only way we can get the person into starting the recovery process is convince them that they need recovery, that they need therapy and counseling. And that's one of the things I ask every therapist and counselor I ever talk with. Do you have advice for the lawyers on how to convince somebody who's been the victim of abuse that they need to go talk about it and understand how it impacts their personality and decision making? And the reason that's terribly important is we're going to have a divorce settlement coming within the next 3, 6, 9 months, maybe even a year, that we need our client to exercise clear judgment and not be colored by the emotional damage that's occurred over a long period of time that seeped into their personality and their confidence of their decision making.